Right, so part three of this week's content is moving from the kind of structural constraints of the university, how it makes class. And in this part, we're going to talk with Ben Lohmeyer about bullying. And so what we're doing here is moving from the broadly structural and how that makes kind of people feel within the institutions, talking a little bit here more about the kind of how this stuff can play out at a kind of very much momentous event kind of relationship level. And we're talking about bullying in a kind of different way, I think, than the mainstream kind of understanding of it is known. So thanks for joining us, Ben. Firstly, before we kind of get into this week's topic, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. Really good to chat. So yeah, my name's Ben. I am here at Flinders Uni. I work in a social work team, but I'm not a social worker. I'm a youth sociologist and I have a background in some youth work. So I kind of get some of the social work frameworks and things, but bring this sort of critical youth studies lens to it. I'm really interested in experiences like bullying and violence and other kind of really violating experiences that young people might have, but theorizing them through attention to institutions and social systems rather than individual behavior, which I think is getting to the point that you're making, Steve, about the difference between how we often think about bullying and how we're kind of approaching it here in this conversation.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So to start off with, let's kind of get straight into it. Tell us a little bit about these examples that we kind of start off with before we kind of get into the conceptual stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, most people, when they think about bullying, and most of the way that bullying is talked about in things like policy, but also places like schools, is that it's kind of an individual, some person who's doing something that's probably harming somebody else. It's really their behavior or their actions at some level that is causing a problem, and it's really identified as that person and those behaviors are a problem, which is really individualizing, obviously, and ignores that sort of institutional social context that I'm really interested in. These examples really begin to highlight that. So the stories and the exchanges that we've got here is a conversation, a focus group that I was having with some young people, and they're discussing and debating this idea of bullying. And so they describe it here as a PG version of violence, which they initially thought was quite funny and is an interesting kind of way of framing it. But their initial thoughts was kind of that it's less intense. So it's not as full on as like a physical fight or some sort of idea we might associate with really aggressive sort of violence. But they go on to say it's a good way to describe it because you don't really see major violence in PG-13 films. That's some more of a mature MA, MS sort of plus category. And that's where you get the more questionable content. So as an observation is kind of really interesting.
I really like it. I mean, we're kind of talking about violence in a number of different ways here. And like when I think about my own school experience, I mean, growing up as a kind of working class kid, going to a school with a bit of violence going on, I experienced violence myself and perpetrated it sometimes, I suppose. But I don't really remember that as much or even feel like it affected me as much as like, I remember kind of teachers' comments more, you know what I mean? Like, so in terms of the things that mark me and things that kind of make me think, made me think about my place in the world, wasn't so much the physical things that kind of happen in those spaces. I'm talking about a white dude here that kind of has a certain amount of masculinity stuff going on back then. It's definitely like, various remarks teachers made to me is the stuff that kind of hurt me from school, I think. So I think that's an interesting way to put it in a way, but like when you start thinking about masculinity, I think blokes want sometimes, reverse the rating there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, okay, so moving on to the next one, Luca.
Yeah, I mean, one other really interesting thing I think in what you're saying though, just because you talked about teachers who are the ones who mark you, it's quite interesting that perhaps it wasn't your peers that you were fighting with that was a problem. It's actually some of these figures who are authority figures or represent the institution you're part of. But we might kind of swing back around to that later.
Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, these guys talked about it as PG-13, something that's perhaps not as intense. But I think part of what they're doing there is linking to what Luca is saying next. So the idea that you don't really notice the PG stuff as much, right? The PG stuff is not as important to you. It's only you really think about it as violence when it becomes something a little bit more intense. And that's kind of what Luca's saying is if you get good at this bullying thing, you transform it into something that's less noticeable, like into something that looks more like a PG version of it. And then because it's less noticeable, less identifiable, it actually gets a lot harder to stop or identify or talk about that kind of behavior. So it disappears in some ways. And so a lot of the stuff that we think about as bullying is the really obvious stuff. I'm really interested in the things that aren't as obvious, that kind of disappear, but really, if we think about it, have that same sort of marking, influencing, violating kind of effect.
Yeah, and more kind of chipping away everyday violence than kind of a big kind of violent act kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of what the last quote at the bottom there is saying that we really just delegitimize all that sort of stuff. We're not really interested in that as a category as part of the category of bullying. We can't say that's something else and probably not as important. It's kind of just stuff that young people do. They're just kind of mean to each other.
Yeah, and so as you said, if it's stuff that just young people do, it's kind of systematic and normal and kind of makes up the effective atmosphere in institution. Therefore, it actually is something we need to consider and something that can therefore change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so there's some more conceptual things here and some quotes. So yeah, tell us about these.
Yeah, so if we're trying to identify those things that are invisible, you kind of have to have ways to talk about them. And I think talking about things like space and time are ways to talk about them. Because if you ask people to think about a thing that they can't really see or identify, then you're not really going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
But if we say, okay, tell us a bit about the space of the school. What does a school look like, and where do these things happen in the school? And then that makes things a little bit easier to talk about. And there's a bunch of research that kind of goes into this in around bullying, but also kind of the gendered nature of violence and the gendered kind of expectations that are placed. And this is where some of the above quotes are saying that often we think about violence and bullying, more violence in particular, as something that happens outside in a public space that is done by men, and typically adult men. And by doing that, we kind of push any kind of harm and violence away into that sort of space instead of kind of seeing it as part of our schooling, if we're in a school, or our everyday environment. And this is saying, well, maybe it's here. It's just that it doesn't have the same sort of presence. It acts in different ways. And so a couple of different stories here are coming from students to say, well, it doesn't. Maybe bullying isn't always physical. Maybe it's verbal. But actually, when I think about it, there's these places in the school that have this association for me. And that's what Cameron is saying here, is saying that if something happens in the yard, so you're seeing that person in the yard again, that seeing that person in the yard can kind of trigger that experience in your head, even if it doesn't happen for you again. So it's kind of invisible because it's happening internally, but it's a reliving of that experience in that space. So that's really interesting. The other one at the bottom there is about a space in a school where the school has a long corridor that runs down the middle of the school. And so this corridor is a space that kind of encourages or enables or makes possible certain types of violence and bullying. And they're telling stories about students lining up elbow to elbow and sort of running down the corridor and bashing into people. That's possible because of the width of it. But also talking about, if the bullying happens in one part of the school, lots of students in the other part can hear about it quickly and kind of rush to that kind of other end of the school and be present there. So if we want to get really technical about it, we could talk about it like as a Foucauldian technology of power, so that it creates an opportunity for the spread of knowledge across the school and also for the surveillance of students in that space by teachers.
Yeah, and it's a collective. We'll talk about the collectivity of what this kind of means later on as well. That kind of the architecture of the space opens up more or less opportunities for that kind of collectivity. Yeah. Okay.
And that can seem really theoretical. So I'll just add one other quick thing there. I know I'm not going to talk too much, so cut me off. But one of the interesting things that I'm thinking about now is also that how those spaces are shaped by class and capital. So, to build a school it costs money, right? So how much money are we going to invest in building this school? Is it a public school? Is it a private school? How much money do we have access to? And so the influence of class and expectations actually goes into the physical shaping of those buildings, which then helps reproduce some of the experiences that students have in them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, that's great. In the course so far, we've kind of used the term symbolic violence, but there's a couple of different conceptions of violence here that you use in your work. Can you just tell us a little bit about what these concepts are?
Yeah, no worries. So obviously violence, very complex idea, and so different ways of thinking about it gives us access to different experiences of violence. And so the idea here in terms of slow violence is trying to talk about things that aren't just physical violence and aren't just happening in the moment. So
Yep.
experiences that are violating, that are somehow distant from their source. So something happens here, and then a long time later, people were affected by it. So this come out of thinking about climate change because it's such a slow moving thing. We've known about the effects of climate change for a long time, but it takes a long time from when the kind of instigating pollution or action happens to when the people who are affected by it. And so you can think about a similar sort of thing in terms of things like bullying and schooling, because sometimes an incident can happen in a school, and then the knowledge of that, the students kind of spread that over time. And so everyone in that school knows that that thing happened over there, and it still has an impact on our culture and what's expected. And in one instance, in this particular project, a student talked about there being a suicide as a result of bullying in another school in that space, in that region. So it wasn't just the school itself affected, but like the whole area is affected. So you see this emotional movement of experience over a long period of time.
Yeah, and social violence is kind of an umbrella term for all these kind of different formations that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because usually, again, violence usually thought about as a physical thing, but we're talking about social experiences that have these violating effects. So we just kind of have this broader term for it.
Yeah. So in terms of the scholarship of bullying, there's been a few different kind of traditions and ways of thinking about it. The kind of first paradigm was very much like you said, it was about a behavioral psychology issue, very much aligning up with kind of notions of individualization that we've looked in the course so far. That's an individual making wrong choices, bad behavior, bad choices, masculinity, that kind of stuff often happening, or things like that, or gendered violence as well. The second paradigm comes at it a little bit differently. So can you tell us what that means?
For sure. So yeah, definitely first paradigm is all those things. And when you look at it, it's actually surprisingly prescriptive in terms of what fits in this category. Like there's usually three main things, which is something has to have, bullying experience has to be intentionally harming someone, has to be a power imbalance, and that power is really conceptualized again individually. And then the last one has to be repeated, is usually the three things that have. And if it's not that, it's not bullying, which is quite bizarre if you step back from it and say, we're going to categorize this range of experiences, but we're only going to really interested in these small ones here. So the second paradigm says, well, maybe we should think a little bit more about that in a broader sense, and look at things like the way that the school environment can create bullying opportunities, the way that physical structures like we've talked about, the way that perhaps pedagogy or teaching practice can create those opportunities as well. So the second paradigm is really just about, so let's blow that apart a little bit and think about it in as many different ways as we can. The other really important part of that, though, I think, is that the first paradigm is really an adult-centric way of thinking about this problem, which is quite weird because in many ways we've talked about bullying as something that happens in schools, but it was an adult sort of defining and refining what this is, and then it gets set in place. And that has just had some critique and argument over time, but there's a lot of research around at the moment that suggests that if you ask young people what bullying is, they don't use that frame. They don't say this is what it is. It's more around their experience. Interestingly, also, if you ask teachers, they don't use that frame. They have this other description as well. So it's not just young people, but there's this weird loop thing that happens that if you define a paradigm and then you ask the students about their experiences of it and they tell you something else, the solution seems to be to educate them better about the paradigm. And so you kind of go around in a circle. So reinforcing that existing kind of system or understanding of it.
Yeah, so the second paradigm kind of starts bringing notions of morality and hierarchies and stuff that like kind of escape the first one. And it kind of then starts to think about how institutions themselves, I suppose, can be recipes for these relationships where bullying is actually just part of the structure. And as we'll show that like, even like teachers seem to use what looked like to us a lot like bullying as of modes of discipline and stuff like that. So we'll get into that. And the paper that we wrote together is influenced by Yoniyama. who talks about bullying as nori. So can you just kind of quickly tell us what the kind of notion of nori is? Because we'll talk about it then in the empirical bit.
Definitely. So this is obviously coming out of a Japanese context. So it's a Japanese word that's just attempting to describe the phenomenon in that space. And we have to be conscious of that cultural context when we want to shift across into our Australian experience. But the idea is essentially that something happens in the group that sets up expectations about the interaction with each other. So the nori is this kind of collective feeling of fun or exaltation that goes along with bullying somebody. And because the group has this strong internal conformity kind of idea that we really want everybody to be the same, and that's particularly true in kind of Japanese culture, but can also translate to here when we think about, say, something a group wants. So if there's a good example of one of the stories from our paper together was a group of students who all want to go on an excursion together. So together, everybody is buying into this idea of going on an excursion, and anybody who threatens the potential of going on an excursion is instantly going to be hated by the group, because of course we all want to go. And that's kind of the effect of nori, is saying everybody believes in this thing, and the good thing of going on the excursion is the emotional high that we're all kind of working towards. And so if a student steps outside of that, they are rightly bullied. Like the group will kind of turn on that person and say, hey, we really want to maintain that.
And if a teacher knows that the group may turn, they can kind of use the singling out of a student to discipline the rest of the group. Yeah,
exactly.
So I think we get to that example in a sec. So let's go through a couple of examples from the paper. I can't remember the name. So it's Alice, Brandon, and Jane. So tell us a little bit here about Alice's story, who was the girl that was broke her foot playing touch footy.
Yeah, so these are all stories of teachers bullying students. So this is the bit that we really paid attention to. And in this story, like you said, Alice is playing touch footy and she hurt her foot and she wanted to opt out of doing that. She goes to the teacher, who she says is a PE teacher, and says, I really needed to have a break from this. Interestingly, she says, you know how PE teachers are, implying that kind of everybody understands the kinds of attitudes that teachers have towards students and perhaps towards participating in this kind of sport. And she was told to really just harden up, eat a spoonful of cement and go back out and play and stop sooking about your sore foot. And so this is an example of obviously like fairly violating her experience. It's probably not going to fit in a category of bullying where it's kind of a repetition, but this has ongoing effects for the student. Obviously, they're injured and they kind of had to live with that effect. And this is a good example of some of those kind of gendered dynamics as well that we've mentioned before. So, stop being a sooky girl. If you weren't a girl, you'd be a man, and then you'd hard up and you just keep playing through your injury.
And what's interesting about this too is like, again, it relates back to what you were talking about before. It wouldn't really count as bullying, the first paradigm, but like Alice experiences this herself as bullying. And so when you're using the second paradigm that we're talking about, that's what counts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so the interesting thing about this story, we asked her, has she ever seen bullying? She gives a kind of fairly straightforward version of a teacher insulting a student about their fashion. And again, and kind of she gets up, calls her a pig and this kind of stuff and leaves. And so we've got one kind of symbolic violence there going on. And then we move into what I think is a kind of almost a form of physical violence, what happens in the second bit. Like the teacher there is essentially, devolved themselves of their like responsibilities of looking after this kid to prioritize a football game, right? So again, there's kind of a normality to that, isn't there? That the second paradigm and the way that we want to think about this kind of stuff wants to fundamentally challenge. The second example is Brandon. And Brandon's the dude that was like threatening the extension. This story is telling us he's getting on the bus to go. So, and he's also someone that kind of has Tourette's. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, this is quite an interesting one because especially when that repetition kind of moment, if we think about these stories for these students, they're telling us these years and years later. So they're going to obviously had a significant impact on their lives. And as a student who, like you said, has Tourette's, so this is something he lives with all the time. He has to keep managing and is very conscious of. And that's what becomes clear in the story, is that he's conscious of his experience of having this this thing that makes him stand out. And that has changed over time, but this was an experience of a teacher really kind of victimizing him because of that. And so
Yep.
his behavior, which for him is not something he can control, sets him apart from the group and somehow threatens their potential to go on the excursion. And so the group is kind of collectively protecting that, but then teachers using that as a way to kind of discipline the whole group, not just that student. It's kind of reinforcing that you're all got to behave in a certain way to be able to go on the excursion.
Yep. And the third example is Jane. So this is interesting here. Like this is a kind of more subtle version, but a kind of, again, a gendered version of the way that teachers, I suppose, separate and kind of almost divide and conquer in the classroom in certain ways. She talks a little bit about like, the teacher talking about, giving these set of boys the respect they deserve, as, kind of backhanded, like, nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of thing. And the whole class kind of knows what's going on here.
Yeah.
And they're all in on it, right? Except for the boys that are kind of being insulted here. And
it kind of gives very little opportunity for these students to do anything about it, because especially because it's a joke, right? It's set up as funny, and like, how can you object to this joke that the students make? Everybody's laughing, is on board. You can see that emotional kind of high that's happening again, and it reinforces the control that the teacher has over the class. So like that process of, and that's what's common across all three stories, right, is that the teacher is exploiting the group dynamic in order to maintain a level of control over the class. Whether it's the joke that everybody gets and so we have to be on board, or if it's the expectations, gendered expectations about how you participate in sport, or if it's about what's considered normal behavior. This is all a way of manipulating that group experience in order to maintain a level of domination and control. And of course, the students who are the subjects of that experience that as a violating experience.
Yeah, and she points out too that like she thinks that like if students see teachers doing that, the kids themselves might think it's all right to do that to them as well. So, it's kind of interesting analysis of how schools work there. So let's move on with just to conclude. So can you kind of sum up I suppose our critical orientation towards bullying in the paper and what we want to say about it?
Yeah, so what I want to say is that if we're going to talk about bullying, we have to pay more attention to, like I was saying, the voices of young people and their experiences, but also the dynamics that set up those potentials. So it's easy in the examples that we've given to kind of really blame teachers, because in many ways they are to blame and should be held accountable for that. But like you said about Jane's reflection on the impact on students' expectations, if teachers get to do this, then maybe students get to do it. Equally, that works kind of the other direction as well. Teachers are doing this because it's accepted and modeled behavior by, say, principals or the school hierarchy more generally. So schools are structured hierarchies at like every conceivable level in many ways. You have students, teachers, principals, department, and that's how it usually is structured. And then you have students come in year 8 and they have to graduate by demonstrating and validating their skills to the next block level, and they just kind of progress on this imagined system of competence up through. And so that model of behavior is a patterned, repeated model of behavior, of hierarchy, of domination and control. And so if you exist in that as a student or a teacher or a principal, then you start to reflect and embody and normalize those kind of behaviors. And that's why right back at the start we said they disappear, because this is what happens in this context. And so if we think about those actions rather than as individual actions, but rather as part of that broader pattern, then we can see that as a structure of violence rather than just individuals who are doing the wrong thing. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. And just to conclude here, to bring it back to some other things we've looked at in the course so far, I mean, in the readings this week, we can look at your notion of how violence works in these situations. Peter Kelly's idea of artifact of expertise has been prominent in the course. We can see here again that the way young people in bully situations, their voices and all that heard, and experts talk about them a lot, including us. But the first paradigm in particular is a problem with that. And the concept of symbolic violence we critique in the paper, because it implies that the young people being bullied are complicit in it. That's what symbolic violence is, the people being on the receiving end are kind of complicit in the system. And what we want to say there is it's not really the case for kids at school, because they can't opt out. They can't just leave. So it's kind of difficult to kind of blame them, and not blame them, but call them complicit in the being on the end of this kind of symbolic violence. So I'll leave it there. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us, Ben. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks for the chat.
Thank you.